Um, Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming, by the way. I'm so excited to be here. Like I mentioned, I'm Kyle Boss. I am a web developer at Tinder, and I currently live in Hollywood, California. However, I wasn't always a web developer. Before this chapter of my life, I was a waiter. This is a picture of me about 10 years ago. Um, and I absolutely loved being a waiter. Um, it's something that really met my here's how I best can describe it. I loved walking in the mornings, into the restaurant. The restaurant that I worked at was a fine dining restaurant, and the windows every morning when I would walk into my shift, the windows were from the floor to the ceiling, and they let in all of these big sun rays, and they were overlooking the beautiful mountains of Colorado Springs, the Rocky Mountains, and the residents, of course, loved the tables that sat next to those windows. And if you were lucky, you would be able to see deer and rabbits come up and watch you eat. Now, I say residents because this wasn't a fine dining restaurant at a hotel or an apartment building. This was a fine dining restaurant in the middle of a retirement home. So that came with such great uh, experiences that otherwise I wouldn't have been able to experience. Working at a retirement home, you begin to develop a bond with the folks that you're serving. You begin to know their names, what food they like, what food they don't like. And you also get to hear their life story. Also, one of the residents' favorite things to do is on special occasions, on events like birthdays or their family coming and visiting, you get to they're one of their favorite things is to be able to choose their favorite waiter and have them serve that meal. So, um, you also get some tough times. For example, sometimes you would walk into the restaurant and you'd feel this palpable grief. Um, and I'd walk into the kitchen and ask, "Hey, what's going on?" And a lot of times folks would say one of the residents has passed away. And those are the days that really hit the hardest. Um, because not only are you serving a restaurant full of grieving people, but you're also grieving yourself because these people are people that you know. They're the people that you work with every day. Now, I feel like I thrived as a waiter. I loved coming in with my notepad, my pen and paper, and writing down the orders and really articulating exactly what the residents order. If they didn't want peas, I would write down no peas. And one day I walked into our team huddle in the morning. A team huddle is basically this meeting that we had every morning where they would describe what food we're out of, any special circumstances for the shift. Maybe someone was out sick, and so I would have to wait more tables. And my manager walked in and started the meeting like normal. But then she started pulling out these devices and giving them to us one by one. And she said, "Hey, everyone, great news. We got new software for the host stand." The host stand used to use like this whiteboard and dry erase marker to mark out who's at what table. And sometimes there'd be mistakes. So they upgraded the software. And so now instead of using a whiteboard, we're keeping track of who's at what table digitally. And that was really exciting. But then she went on and said, "Here, it also takes orders." And so she gave each waiter this scientific calculator looking device. And we all get one and we're looking at it, and it kind of looked like a scientific calculator. And the way that it worked is it was kind of like T9 texting, like texting back in the early 2000s, where you'd have to press the number 7 4 times to get the letter S. And she said, "From now on, you'll be using this to take orders." Not only is it hosting software, but it's ordering software too. And I'm like, I figured I'll give that a try. I mean, why not? We were asked to, kind of forced to, right? So for the next few weeks, I took orders with that. As I mentioned, it was really difficult to type. I didn't really get the same fluidity as writing with pen and paper. And within a week, the manager pulls us aside in our next team huddle and asks, okay, what's going on? The order accuracy is not great. We've been getting a lot of plates returned to the kitchen. And I mentioned, well, it's this device. I can't write as well as I used to be able to on pen and paper. And everyone seemed to agree. The host was like, "No, please don't take away my software. This is amazing. I've been really thriving for the last week." Some waiters even said, "Yes, I kind of like this." The ones who are used to texting, I think, really enjoyed this. But a majority of us at the time weren't used to T9 texting, and it was very difficult to use. And so we had a compromise. We decided that the host stand can continue to use the software. The waiters who liked using the software as well can also continue using it. But those who preferred pen and paper can go back to using pen and paper. No harm, no foul. After that, my accuracy started coming back. I felt more confident again, working with pen and paper, taking orders. I got less people returning their food to the kitchen. And going forward, I realized that there was a lesson to be learned. In order for a team to thrive, in order for a team to be successful, we have to give everyone on the team the tools that they need to do their job efficiently and effectively. Okay. And it wasn't just here in this circumstance, in this chapter of my life. I took it with me through college, I took it with me through work. And this experience showed up in my life recently when coming into Tinder. Now, when I joined Tinder, we were working on creating a blog. And now blogs have two stakeholders. Okay. If you think about it, the first one is writers. Without writers, we wouldn't have a blog. There wouldn't be content for the users to read, to consume, right? And so, in order for our writers to be able to create the best content that they can possibly produce, doing it efficiently and effectively, we wanted to be sure that they use the tools that they needed to thrive and to be able to create this content efficiently and effectively. And for us, after thinking about it and talking to the writers on our team, we decided that that would be WordPress. WordPress is absolutely amazing for writing content. It's made for writing these blog content based websites, right? And there's a reason why they say 1 out of every 3 websites are on WordPress. It's very easy to use. It's great for managing content, great for writing. Now, we also have a second stakeholder within a blog, and we identified them as engineers. Of course, we need engineers to create a blog because without a medium to read this content, it's going to be very difficult for users to be able to access all of this great stuff that the writers have wrote. And of course, we want our engineers to also use the best tools that they know, that they use, that they're used to. Um, and that's going to be different depending on the engineering team that you go to. For us at Tinder, we are a React shop. A lot of our websites are built off of React. So our architecture is already in React. We already have an ecosystem for it. So if our blog is in React, it's kind of like plug and play at that point. So as you see here, we have writers and engineers as our two stakeholders. Writers love WordPress, and our engineers on our team are used to using React. And so it would be a great thing if we could somehow use both of these tools together, right? As we mentioned before, the lesson learned is that if every stakeholder on the team gets to use the tools that they know, that they thrive with, the team's going to be successful. And we found that this is possible, and we found it's possible through the JAMstack. Now, it's totally fair if you might not know exactly what the JAMstack is yet. We're going to go over a high-level overview of what it means to be a JAMstack website. Now, the first thing that you all might be curious about, if you have never heard of the JAMstack, is what does JAM stand for? Well, it stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And so the whole idea is that JAMstack sites are usually comprised of at least one or two of these things: JavaScript, APIs, or markup. However, it's very fair to say, like, well, I have a Ruby on Rails site. Is it uses JavaScript, APIs, and even markup? Is that considered JAMstack? I think a lot of people would argue not so much. Um, and there's a few alternative definitions that are floating around about like what the Jamstack site really is. Like, what is the definition of a Jamstack site? I like to claim that it's a static site, a static site that is created dynamically. Okay, a Jamstack site is a static site that's created dynamically. Now, in order to do that, in order to create a static site dynamically, you need some tools. These tools are commonly known as static site generators, or lovingly called SSGs. And there's a lot out there. There's Next, there's Nuxt, there's Gatsby, there's Eleventy, there's Redwood, and it feels like there's more and more coming every single year. And they're great. What they a lot of times do is take dynamic content, usually like APIs or markup from some repo, and pass them into a JavaScript app and output a static site. So here's what that looks like for us at Tinder with our blog. So we have our static site generator, and we give it the URL to our WordPress API. Now, I didn't know this when I joined and when I first started, but WordPress comes with an incredibly robust RESTful API. So if you go to wp-json/posts, for example, you'll get all of your public posts. If you go to /authors, you'll get all of your authors in JSON format, tags, categories. Basically, every single piece of content WordPress offers, you can grab from the API. So what your static site generator will do is on build time, it will crawl that WordPress API and grab everything that it possibly can and stuff it into this local state. This local state a lot of times looks like GraphQL. You can access it in some sort of local, it's stored in some sort of local state fashion. And after you have everything from your WordPress or all of your dynamic content APIs, and after it's in local storage, or local memory, I should say, it's passed into your JavaScript app. And for us, like I mentioned, we're using React. And so a lot of times it's passed into React components via GraphQL queries or some other methodology, depending on the static site generator that you're using. So at this point, you have a React app full of your WordPress content. And your static site generator has one more duty, one more job. It's going to take your big React app and chop it into a bunch of static HTML and JavaScript files. At this point, those HTML and JavaScript files, those are your static site. That's what you're going to upload to S3 or to Netlify or Vercel, and you're going to statically host these files. And this is really cool. This is where this idea of a Jamstack site being a static site created dynamically comes from. We use this dynamic API, this WordPress API. We use that content to create this static site. And that's where the Jamstack really shines. So because of this, our writers get to use WordPress and our engineers get to use React, and everyone is happy. Everyone gets to thrive and use the tools that they need to make sure that their individual role in making this blog a success is effective. So the Jamstack really shined there in helping everyone make sure that their independent role was able to be completed. Now, that's not the only place where the Jamstack shined, though. I think you'll find this next story really interesting. One morning, I'm a morning person, so I like to wake up early in the morning. And the first thing I do is I open up all of these news tabs from local news stations and read the news and watch the sunrise, listen to the birds tweet. And this one particular morning, soon after we went live with the blog, I was reading my news and I went to this one local news website and it looked fine. I read the article, closed the tab, went on to the next article. And in this particular news website, it looked like it got a complete redesign. It was a little bit more modern. It had a big hero image on it. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. You might be thinking, yeah, that's cool that this news website like got a new modern look. Except it didn't seem like that hero image was supposed to be there. It was a plant. It was a picture of a plant. In fact, it was a succulent. I'm like, okay, this is really weird. This has nothing to do with the news. I think it might have got hacked or something. So I went to another local news website. And sure enough, this totally different local news website had that exact same picture, that exact same new design, that exact same succulent. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is so weird. And as I navigated the web, I started noticing more and more websites had the succulent on it. TechCrunch had that succulent. 9 to 5 Mac succulent. And I am like, oh my goodness, what is going on? And like a good millennial at the time, I went to Twitter and it looked like I was not the only one seeing all these succulents everywhere. Kyle Frost said it best. It was a big day for succulents. And then Kyle said hashtag WordPress. And for those of you who have started a new WordPress site recently, you might recognize this succulent. This succulent is basically the main theme that you get when you start a new WordPress blog. And what was happening was a lot of WordPress sites were being reverted to the original theme that WordPress offers. And so that's why everyone was seeing these succulents. Now, I have some good news and I have some bad news when it comes to our blog in relation to this bug. And I'm going to start off with the bad news. So our WordPress also was reverted. And that meant for us that all of the theming I did on the back end, because the back end of WordPress where the writers write also is a theme, all of that theming of customized buttons that I added or customized inputs where they can customize things like background color, all that was gone. So we couldn't create any more new content. And that was kind of a sad moment. That is bad news for us. However, here's the good news. Our writers weren't able to write. However, our readers were still able to read. They were still able to access our blog and consume all of the content. They from a reader's perspective, they were not aware that anything was wrong. They were still able to navigate our site, read the content, search. So yes, we did have a WordPress outage, but our React app is still up. Now, you might be thinking, okay, I thought we were highly dependent on WordPress. What gives? Well, that's a very fair question. During build time, we are highly dependent on WordPress. During build time, we are crawling the WordPress's API. So yes, we totally need WordPress, but that's during build time. After we get those static HTML and JavaScript files from our static site generator, we're totally independent from WordPress, right? We have these HTML files that already have our WordPress's content in them. So at that point, when we are live in production on runtime, we actually are very independent from WordPress. So yes, it was actually a huge bummer that our WordPress was down. However, because we're using the JAMstack, it didn't really make too much of a difference. And that was another space that the JAMstack shined for us. And I got to write the funny email to everyone explaining what happened. That yeah, our WordPress is down. However, we survived the as I like to call it, the succulent apocalypse of the day. Now, this is a case study, and so while we have been discussing all of the amazing things that worked for us for the JAMstack, there also are some challenges that we came across along the way. And so I want to be sure when you go back to your job or your team and you mention, hey, I think the Jamstack might be good for us. I also want to explore the challenges. I want to be sure that you're able to plan ahead and foresee some things that are some common hurdles that we see right now with the Jamstack. And they're all overcomable. Nothing is like too um, too perilous. However, it's always nice to be sure that you know of these ahead of time, and that way you can plan ahead and integrate some of these challenges into your roadmap. Now, we are an AWS shop at Tinder, and so we decided that we were going to host and build all of our Jamstack sites within Amazon Web Services. And so here's what that looked like for us. Um, First, we had an API gateway. And so this API gateway is great for whenever there was an update within WordPress. For example, we got a new post that was published, or a post was deleted, or even a typo was corrected. Every time that would happen, we would make a secure request to our API gateway, and that would kick off a code pipeline. It would tell our code pipeline, "Hey, we're ready to make another build." Okay, and that code pipeline, its main job was to grab our Jamstack code for our blog from GitHub and then pass it on to our code build. And our code build had quite the job. First, it would take that GitHub code, and it would also pull our cache from S3. And you see, every time you build your website with a static site generator, a lot of times they will keep a cache. And this cache is really important because it will, every time you build a website, there's a lot of optimizations that happen, but those optimizations only need to be done once. So, what a lot of Jamstack static site generators do is they take all of these optimizations and store them inside of a cache directory. So, hopefully, the next time that you run the build, the build will run a lot faster. So, we store that cache in S3 and we pull it down. So, once we have our GitHub code and once we have our cache, we run our static site generators build command. For Gatsby, for example, that's Gatsby build, or a lot of times it's built into your npm or yarn scripts, so you could probably run yarn build, but we run that build command. And once it's completed, we're going to get two outputs. The first one is going to be the updated cache. So we take that updated cache and we push it back to S3. That way, the next time we run the code, we'll have all those optimizations again, right? The second output is going to be our static site, all those HTML and JavaScript files. And so we take those static HTML files and upload them to another S3 bucket for hosting. Now, to improve the user's experience and to cache all of our requests, we're using CloudFront. And also, CloudFront's definitely necessary for the SSL certificate attaching to S3, right? So we also use CloudFront for caching and that purpose as well. And within CloudFront, we're also using two Lambda edges. So we have a Lambda Edge request and a response as well. And for those of you who might not be familiar with Lambda Edge, Lambda Edge basically allows us to tap into the user's request and make some edits before it gets to CloudFront. So, for example, or sorry, I should say before it grabs the HTML file from S3. So, for example, for our blog, we could say we see that the user request is the preferred language is in French, and the user is coming from France. So let's redirect them to the French version of our blog, for example. So we had all of these resources in AWS, API Gateway, Code Pipeline, Code Build, S3, CloudFront, the Lambda edges, the S3 for cache. And of course, we want to make this reproducible. So if we ever want to create a new environment, for example, development, sandbox or staging, pre-prod, production environment, if we ever wanted to create a new environment from scratch, we could do it reliably and repeatedly. And so for that reason, we attach everything to a cloud formation. Now, this is quite a bit of work, I would say. Um, when I think of serverless hosting or static hosting, I usually only think of the S3 bit. Um, it's it's rare that I ever think about everything that surrounds it, such as the build pipeline, the communications between WordPress and AWS. Um, Now, this is not a bad thing. It's just something that I was not expecting when jumping into the JAMstack. Now, there's also another component to this that makes it a little bit spicy. Um, when we first started our blog, build times took 10 seconds. It was relatively fast, right? And then as time went on and we created more and more and more pages, we got to 30 seconds and then 1 minute. And then our build times took an hour eventually, 2 hours. And then at the height of our blog, we reached 4-hour build times. 4 hours. And so that meant, yeah, if we had to correct a typo, it would take 4 hours for that typo to be fixed. And so that meant, by the way, it looked pretty linear. When looking at the number of pages versus the build duration, definitely not a scientific calculation, but it felt and appeared to be very linear, this time increase. But what that meant for us is that we had to continuously tweak our build pipeline to try to make these build times as fast as possible. For example, as more and more pages were added, more and more optimizations were had, meaning our cache got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And remember, we pulled the S3 cache, right, in the code build step. And pulling that S3 cache takes time. And the bigger the cache is, the longer it's going to take. And so what we ended up doing is chopping up the S3 cache into many, many different small chunks and pulling them in parallel and then pushing them in parallel. So we ended up making a lot of these micro adjustments to try to keep making the build time at least somewhat manageable. Now, again, AWS building it yourself is totally fine. I call it the DIY approach. Just know that it's going to take a little bit more work than just having an S3 bucket hosting. Now, there's the DIY approach. The alternative is the do it for me approach. The approach where there's a SaaS model out there that does the building and hosting for you. And this is an equally good approach depending on the amount of resources and time you have. So, for example, there's services such as Gatsby Build, which will build all of your resources for you if you're using the Gatsby static site generator. There's Vercel, which created Next.js, which will do the building and hosting. There's Netlify, which is more of a generic builder and hoster, which will do all the building and hosting for you. And I believe all of these are free for the hobby tier, right? But obviously will cost some more money if you're going through the enterprise route. The AWS route, definitely probably a little bit more inexpensive if you're an enterprise company, but also there's a lot more setup there. So when you go back to your team and you're discussing the pros and cons of the JAMstack, incorporate this idea too. Think about what decision you would make when you run into this fork of the road. Would you choose building it yourself, or would you choose having a SaaS service do the building and hosting for you? Each one is equally viable. Each one is totally perfectly fine. It just really depends on your use case. So I hope throughout this talk, you got some pretty cool insights into what it's like using the JAMstack in production. From my experience, it's been an absolute blast. Yes, there's some small challenges along the way, but nothing is not overcomable if you just put a little bit of thought and ingenuity into it. So I would like to open it up for questions. Feel free to always reach out. Um, my Twitter handle, by the way, is like a Kyle Boss, and my email is kyle.boss@gotinder.com. My inbox is always open. I'm always open to hearing about new ideas, questions. So feel free to send me a message, or if you're here now, feel free to shout out your question here, and I'll be more than happy to answer. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Geekle. This has been absolutely amazing.
Thank you, Kyle. It was a great speech. How was the feeling after talk? After how was the impression? This is your second online conference.
Yeah, it's been absolutely amazing. Oh my gosh. Yeah, this has been so much fun. I don't know if everyone's been looking at the other talks too, but the other talks have been absolutely amazing. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'm sure that a lot of people get new information. So me too. It was interesting. There are some questions. By the way, I want to note that if you have any questions, please comment below. We will get back soon because we have Q&A session, and Kyle will answer all of them. So there are a few questions that I want to ask you. So
absolutely.
Have you ever had any difficulties while you started JAMstack, to use JAMstack?
Have I ever used any alternatives to JAMstack?
No, when you started to use JAMstack, did you had any difficulties at the beginning?
Oh, yeah, good question. Yeah, so the JAMstack paradigm, depending on the static site generator you use, is slightly different. I mean, it really depends on the static site generator. Each one's different. Gatsby versus Next versus Levity. But the paradigm of thinking is slightly different. And it took me a while to actually understand even just the high level of what's going on. That first, we're going to be grabbing from an API, and then it's going to be stuffed into a React or a Vue app. However, what I found really helpful are the docs. The I feel like that's such a cliche statement, but for the Jamstack community, the docs are really, really clear. I know both Gatsby and Vercel and all the other companies that have static site generators put a lot of energy into making the documentation easy to read and very accessible to everyone. So that helped significantly for me to understand the paradigm. In term, also, by the way, I didn't know GraphQL, and a lot of static site generators use GraphQL as the central state to store everything in, and that was also a small little challenge. However, a lot of static site generators like Gatsby include graphical, so it's also a fun way to learn GraphQL if you're not familiar with that as well. I have to say, I put off learning the JAMstack because I saw it required GraphQL, and I quickly realized that it's definitely not a prerequisite to jumping into it. Like, it's something that you can learn in parallel. But yeah, I'd say those two are the biggest challenges I ran into.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. So we talked about JAMstack and how it helps, how it can help us. But could you say some disadvantages of JAMstack? So I know that every framework, every library has its own disadvantages, but could you provide some?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, there is the build time that we mentioned. It's going to be different depending on every static site generator, obviously. It's going to depend on what optimizations each one has. But the build time for us was a big challenge that we've had to overcome. As we mentioned, it could take at times 4 hours to even fix a typo. Now, I would dare to say that was probably our biggest challenge. And I do have to say that a lot of the companies that have a static site generator are working hard on that issue. They know that it's like a big thing to tackle. Now, I didn't mention why there's that big build time though. There's a lot of optimizations that happen. A lot of these static site generators are optimizing your images. They're doing lazy loading on the fly. They are creating router optimization. So, for example, when you hover over a link, your resources for the next page are actually being prefetched for a lot of static site generators. So there's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes, which is why the build time takes so long. If you have enough pages on your site, as I mentioned, build times when you first get going, or if you have a relatively small site, are actually really fast. It's for these big 1,000-page websites that the build time takes long. But that's a disadvantage that we saw along the way.
Yeah, thanks. And my last question,
Sure.
any alternatives for JAMstack?
Oh yeah, so the JAMstack is just one way of many different alternatives to creating a website, right? Like there's the dynamic websites like Ruby on Rails sites or like any like a Node.js or a standard React website. Like there's so many alternatives to using a JAMstack website. JAMstack sites are relatively new. I feel like it's been around for about 5 years now, which I guess that's somewhat like of a established platform, but it's kind of a new tool and a new way of looking at dynamic sites. So I wouldn't say that it's like a one size fits all or a Swiss Army knife of solutions. There's so many other solutions out there other than JAMstack. The the dynamic sites that we're used to is usually perfectly fine. But what's cool about the JAMstack, like we mentioned, is that you get this dynamic content, but you get to serve it statically, meaning you get to be serverless. You can go viral and not have to scale up or down your servers. It's those kinds of benefits you get with the JAMstack.
Yeah. Thank you very much.